We're in 2 Samuel chapter 2. 2 Samuel chapter 2. What we're looking at in the next couple of chapters is this vacuum that has been caused by the death of Saul and Jonathan. People were assuming that when Saul died, Jonathan would take the throne, but Saul and Jonathan both die in the same battle. So we have no king over Israel, and we've just had a pretty strong defeat at the hand of the Philistines. So somebody's going to have to step up and take the reins of ruling. And we end up with two different rulers where we had one before. Unfortunately, there is an heir of Saul that can step up and take the throne, and he is supported by some. And then, of course, there's David, who is supported by others. And so in 2, 3, 4, we see the outcome of that kind of a problem, and we see a civil war develop. So we'll look at little sections here tonight. David was anointed a long time ago, but the guy who anointed him has been dead for quite a while. For the last several years, he's been an outlaw. He's been a popular outlaw, at least in the southern part of the country, but still an outlaw. And as is his custom, he asked God to tell him what to do next. So again, he endears himself, at least to us, in the fact that he doesn't just go out on his own and decide what he's going to do, but he asks God to give him guidance, and he receives it. So chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. In the course of time, David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go up to one of the towns of Judah?" he asked. The Lord said, "Go up." David asked, "Where shall I go?" "To Hebron," the Lord answered. So David went up there with his two wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. David also took the men who were with him, each with his family, and they settled in Hebron and its towns. The men of Judah came to Hebron, and there they anointed David king over the tribe of Judah. When David was told that it was the men from Jabesh-Gilead who had buried Saul, he sent messengers to them to say to them, "The Lord bless you for showing this kindness to Saul, your master, by burying him. May the Lord now show you kindness and faithfulness, and I too will show you the same favor because you have done this. Now then, be strong and brave, for Saul, your master, is dead, but the people of Judah have anointed me king over them." So he has one group that comes and asks him if he will be their king, and they anoint him. And then David turns around and sends ambassadors to Jabesh-Gilead to kind of curry favor with those people and to congratulate them on the work that they did in taking care of Saul and Jonathan's bodies when they were killed and humiliated after that battle. So you might remember that David has been a hero in Judah for a long time. His family is from the tribe of Judah. So he at least began his journey there. When he killed Goliath, I'm sure that everybody celebrated, but the hometown folks probably celebrated even more. He killed off the enemies of Judah while he was living among the Philistines. Remember, the king allowed him to take over Ziklag, and they were running campaigns out of Ziklag. And he would tell the king that he had been down toward Egypt, battling with people down there. What he was really doing was fighting all the enemies just south of Judah and getting rid of the problems that Judah had. So when Saul is dead and Judah's looking for somebody to replace him as their king, then David's an obvious candidate. When he defeated the Amalekites, he took part of the ransom that he got from defeating the Amalekites and gave it to some of the household leaders around the tribe of Judah. So this is kind of a no-brainer for his home tribe. When he comes in with his men and moves to Hebron, they all show up and say, "We want you to be our king." So David is finally anointed king. He's actually got the title king. He's been, in God's mind, king over all of Israel for years now. But he finally has a group of people that have anointed him as their king. but he is by no means in control of all of Israel. He is one king. In the northern part, north of Judah and farther up, we have another candidate for king that is anointed and begins ruling in a different place. So look at verse 8. It says, "Meanwhile, Abner, son of Ner, the commander of Saul's army, had taken Ish-Bosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim. He made him king over Gilead, Asherie, and Jezreel, also over Ephraim, Benjamin, and all of Israel." So we have particular groups, some clans, and the tribe of Benjamin that are all in. And then in general, he's the king over all of Israel. So it's not that all 11 out of 12 tribes have signed on, just that he is the king apparent, following his father's footsteps. So they anoint him to be king. And there are a few groups that are very much in his camp, and those are listed. And then you just get that tagline, as well as all of Israel. So he is considered by his people to be king over all of Israel. That doesn't tell us exactly what all of Israel thought about it at the time. Ish-Bosheth, the son of Saul, was 40 years old when he became king over Israel. He reigned 2 years. The tribe of Judah, however, remained loyal to David. The length of time David was king in Hebron over Judah was 7 years and 6 months. So just by comparison of the first kings that kind of come into these two separated kingdoms, David is 3 times as long or more in his kingdom than is Ish-Bosheth. But Ish-Bosheth is, at least for a period of time, their answer, Abner's answer, to try to keep the kingdom of Israel under Saul's family name. The Abner, son of Ner, together with the men of Ish-Bosheth, son of Saul, left Mahanaim and went to Gibeon. Joab, the son of Zeruiah, and David's men went out and met them at the pool of Gibeon. One group sat down on one side of the pool, one group sat down on the other. I did a little bit of reading this afternoon about the Civil War. I was just looking for some example of something like this, where the generals from both sides show up in the same place and have a conversation before they have a battle. The kind of brother versus brother that we ran into in the late 1800s in our country. And I found one really interesting story, and I wanted to share it with you because the nurse in this situation is a fellow named Walt Whitman. You ever heard of Walt Whitman? So Walt Whitman is a nurse. He is treating, by his account, about 100,000 sick or wounded soldiers during the Civil War, both Union and Confederate. He says, I never asked. It wasn't part of my decision-making of who I would help as to where they were from. But he kept a journal, as you would imagine that Walt Whitman would. And his entry for May 28th and 29th of 1865, he talks about 2 brothers, one who fought for the South, one who fought for the North. Their last name is Prentice. They were both raised in Maryland, which was kind of a border state. The older brother rose in the ranks in the Northern Army. The younger brother went into the Southern Army. And as things turned out, the older brother led one of the final assaults on the Confederate stockade, the Confederate, where they were dug in the South, and he breached the wall where his brother was. He was shot through the chest, through his left lung. About the same time, his brother took a shrapnel blast just above his knee. He would eventually have to have his leg amputated. But both brothers ended up wounded in the same place at the same time. The younger brother asks if they know his brother, since he knows what regiment his brother's in. They said, yes, he's right over there. He's been wounded. They take the younger brother to the older brother. The older brother will not speak to him because he's a Confederate soldier until a few minutes go by and things soften up. But here's Walt Whitman's discussion of the two brothers. He helped nurse both of them in the hospital in near Baltimore. I stayed tonight a long time by the bedside of a new patient, a young Baltimorean, about 19 years old. He was very feeble, his right leg amputated, can't sleep hardly at all, has taken a great deal of morphine, which, as usual, is costing more than it comes to. Evidently very intelligent and well-bred, very affectionate, held on to my hand, put my hand to his face, not willing to let me leave. As I was lingering, soothing him in his pain, he says to me suddenly, "I hardly think you know who I am. I don't wish to impose on you. I'm a rebel soldier." I said I did not know that, but it made no difference. Visiting him daily for about 2 weeks after that while he lived, death had marked him and he was quite alone. I loved him much. I always kissed him and he did me. In an adjoining ward, I found his brother, an officer of rank, a Union soldier, brave and religious man. He was with the 6th Maryland Infantry, 6th Corps, wounded in one of the engagements at Petersburg. He lingered. He suffered much. He died in Brooklyn in '65. It was in the same battle both were hit. One was a strong Unionist, the other a secessionist. Both fought on their respective sides, both badly wounded, both brought together here after a separation of 4 years, and each died for his cause. Isn't that something? It's a sad commentary on where we were in our history at that time. Now, move that over to David. These guys knew each other. This wasn't a bunch of folks who had never heard of one another. These are folks who had fought in the army together. They had been in Saul's army. The commander of the northern troops, Abner, and David knew one another fairly well. We'll talk about that here in another minute. Joab, the leader of David's group, knew Abner. So anyway, they show up at this appointed place. One sits on one side of the pool. One group sits on the other. Look at verse 14. Abner said to Joab, "Let's have some of the young men get up and fight hand to hand in front of us." "All right, let them do it," Joab said. So they stood up and were counted off, 12 men for Benjamin and Ish-Bosheth, son of Saul, and 12 for David. Each man grabbed his opponent by the head, thrust his dagger into his opponent's side, and they all fell down together. So that place in Gibeah was called Helkath Hazazurim, which means the place of the daggers or place of death. The battle that day was very fierce. Abner and the Israelites were defeated by David's men. So the first big encounter, David's men win, which we kind of expect. Abner is a man of honor. He's a great general. He was a great general in Saul's army, but his side does not win. We'll get some numbers here in a little bit of how many each side lost. But there's a story within a story here that starts in verse 18. You have some of David's nephews. Notice the 3 sons of Zeruiah. Zeruiah is David's sister. And so if you look over in, let me see if I remembered to write it down. 1 Chronicles chapter 2 has a listing of David's family members. And Zeruiah is listed there with these 3 sons and also some other offspring. But Joab, Abishai, and Asahel are all nephews of David, and they're all in the army. Asahel was fleet-footed as a wild gazelle. He chased Abner, turning neither to the right nor to the left as he pursued him. Abner looked behind him and said, "Is that you, Asahel?" He knows the kid. He says, "It is." And Abner said, "Turn aside to the right or to the left. Take on one of the young men. Strip him of his weapons." But Asahel would not stop chasing him. Again, Abner warned Asahel, "Stop chasing me. Why should I strike you down? How could I look your brother Joab in the face?" 2 opposing generals. The brother of the opposing general is chasing you. And Abner says, "I don't want to kill you. I don't want to dishonor your brother. I don't want to do something to anger Joab. Joab and I are not enemies were just generals in opposing armies. Isn't that odd? I mean, there's not a sense of hatred here. There's a sense of camaraderie. But Asahel refused to give up. So Abner thrust the butt of his spear into Asahel's stomach, but the spear came out through his back. He didn't even hit him with the sharp end. Hit him with the dull end, and it ruptured him and went out through his back. He fell there and died on the spot. And every man stopped when he came to the place where Asahel had fallen and died. But Joab and Abishai pursued Abner. And as the sun was setting, they came to a hill of Ammah near Giah on the way to the wasteland of Gibeah. The men of Benjamin rallied behind Abner, and they formed themselves into a group, and they took their stand on top of the hill. Abner called out to Joab, "Must the sword devour forever? Don't you realize that this will end in bitterness? How long before you order your men to stop pursuing your fellow Israelites? We're all on the same team. Why are we killing each other?" This is the first big battle. Joab answered, "As surely as God lives, if you had not spoken, the men would have continued pursuing them until morning." So Joab blew the trumpet, and all the troops came to a halt, and they no longer pursued Israel, nor did they fight anymore. Now, this isn't the end of the conflict, but for that day anyway, that was the end of the battle. So all of these guys would have been known to each other, and probably the earliest readers of 2 Samuel would have known who these people were, or had some kind of understanding of the history of what was going on with David's family fighting against Abner and his group after David and Abner having been together for so long. Let me remind you of at least one thing when David and Abner were together. Do you remember, not the first time, but the second time David was able to sneak up on Saul? The first time Saul was in the cave, and he cuts off the corner of his robe. The second time, he sneaks into the camp, and he gets the water jug and the spear that are next to Saul, and he takes them out and stands up on the hill and calls out. Whose name does he call? Abner. "Hey, Abner, how come you let me sneak in there and take Saul's stuff? Why aren't you guarding our king any better than that?" It's the same guy. So they have a long history. They've been around each other. And Abner has a respect for David, and we'll see even more so later on that Abner will come over to David's side, at least briefly. But for now, he is the leader of the group that's trying to get Ish-Bosheth's kingdom underway. All that night, Abner and his men marched through the Arabah. They crossed the Jordan and continued through the morning hours and came to Mahanaim. Joab stopped pursuing Abner and assembled the whole army. Besides Asahel, 19 of David's men were found missing. So we can do the math. You've got Asahel and 19 is 20. Right? So they've lost 20 people in the battle. But David's men had killed 360 Benjamites who were with Abner. They took Asahel and buried him in his father's tomb at Bethlehem. Then Joab and his men marched all night and arrived at Hebron by daybreak. So we have an important connection again back to Bethlehem. When you get to the New Testament and you have Joseph and Mary going to Bethlehem and Jesus being born in Bethlehem, King Herod killing all the baby boys in and around Bethlehem. For us, it's a New Testament thing, right? We think in terms almost of the Christmas story, right? When you say Bethlehem, people go, "Oh, well, that's where Jesus was born," and they think Christmas story. When these people heard Bethlehem, they thought David. That's where David's from. That's where David's family was. That's where he grew up. And so when they stop at Bethlehem to drop off the body of Asahel with David's sister, that holds a lot of importance for the group of people who would have first been reading this. That they would have understood that they had to stop in that very important place, David's hometown, so that they could bury the dead of David's family before they came back to Hebron to be where David was. I don't know at this point whether the rest of David's family is at Bethlehem or whether they're still over across the Dead Sea. Remember the first, Saul was chasing them, and so he got his mom and dad and took them over across the Dead Sea. They may have come out of exile by now, so they may have been there for the funeral, as brief as it was, of their grandson. But this is David's mom and dad's grandson that gets killed in the battle. So again, it's a horrible civil war kind of situation. So from there, I got interested, since they told us the numbers of those who had died in this battle. I wondered what was the biggest loss of life in our Civil War. Does anybody know that? Anybody a Civil War buff? Over 200,000 altogether. The biggest single battle was Gettysburg. 3,155 Union troops, 4,708 Confederates. That's dead. Now the ones that were injured were, up in the tens of thousands. And as most of us realize, a wound that you received in the Civil War was not well cared for on the battlefield. They did the best they could with what they had. And a lot of guys died young because they had been in the war, even though they didn't die in the war. So same thing was true in David's day. Hand-to-hand, spears and swords and rocks and choking people down. I mean, it was in-your-face kind of battlements. And if you survived it, you still carried the scars for years if you lived that long in his day and age. So Civil War is a horrible thing. David was dealing with it, trying to honor Saul's memory and hold together his little fledgling kingdom all at the same time. And so it takes God and a man like David to get that kind of thing done. But we'll take a look at some more of that, Lord willing, next week. Any questions, thoughts about that? All right, we'll tell you guys bye.